Why is it important that we face our fears with courage? Many of us have been able to sort of outrun our fears for years. We just go, if you keep running fast enough, you can stay ahead of your fears. God makes it clear He wants us to face our fears with courage. Why? Because the number one thing that will keep you from trusting in God and experiencing His purpose and His blessing in your life, and the number one thing that will keep you from obeying God and growing in Him, is fear. Because spiritual growth comes about not just by reading the Bible and learning a lot about the Bible and having more knowledge. That's important, but ultimately spiritual growth comes from stepping out in obedience to God when He calls us to take a step of faith. Probably the most spiritually immature church in the New Testament was also the church that had the most knowledge, had a lot of knowledge, and that was the Corinthian church. And knowledge that is not applied and acted upon and in obedience to God ultimately does not produce spiritual growth. What produces spiritual growth is God says, I want you to take a step of faith. And a step of faith is called a step of faith because it's going to take some faith. It's going to be risky. It's going to be scary to take that step. But we face our fears, and in spite of our fears, we obey God. And when we do that, we grow. But the thing you need to know is that every time God challenges you to take a step of faith, your fear is going to come and try to hold you back from doing that. And so we need to deal with our fear, or else ultimately we will not obey God, trust in God, and experience what God has for us. The fear will come and paralyze us. Fear will come and rob us of our joy. How many of you have ever seen a fearful, joyful person? I've seen fearful, self-pitying people, fearful, grumbling people. I don't think I've ever seen a fearful, joyful person, because fear tends to rob your joy. Fear will also erode our self-confidence. About 15, 20 years ago, there was a study done by an institute of psychology that dealt with kind of a paradox that didn't seem to make sense. And that was that many people who are intelligent, good-looking, gifted, and successful in their careers, people you would expect to have a very high self-esteem and sense of self-confidence, they discovered actually many of them had a poor sense of self-worth. And so they asked themselves, why would that be? Since those would be the very people you'd expect to have a high sense of self-esteem. And what they discovered was the primary factor that determined the level of a person's self-esteem was not looks, intelligence, accomplishments, but how they responded to difficult, fear-inducing situations. Those who faced head-on difficult, fear-inducing situations, rather than avoid them, run from them, ignore them, were people who had a higher sense of self-esteem. So one of the things fear will come and do is erode your sense of self-confidence and ultimately keep you from obeying God, unless you face your fears with courage. Now, courage, let me say a word about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the willingness to face your fears and obey God in spite of your fears. You may be facing a situation that scares the bejeebies out of you. I don't know what bejeebies are, but you'll be so scared the bejeebies will leave you. The important thing is that we face our fears. It's not fearless. The only people who are fearless are people who just have no awareness of the danger that they're facing. Or react on instinct. And again, unaware, we're oblivious. Fearless people are not people who are brave, they are people who are ignorant. When I grew up, I grew up in Newark. And I did things that would scare the bejeebies out of me now. And it's like, when I think about some of the things I did, and we all know the mother's curse. When you grow up, I hope you have a son just like you. And I was fearless, not because I was brave, but because I was ignorant. I was oblivious. It never occurred to me jumping from one apartment house rooftop to another one that you could slip or miscalculate and fall 45 feet down to a concrete alleyway. Or it never occurred to me that you can only go so high on climbing a tree until the branches will no longer support your weight. Never occurred to me that it's virtually impossible to climb up a telephone pole and sit on top of it. I could get up to the top, but I kept trying to figure out how to get on top of it. Never occurred to me that jumping on a swing, jumping off a swing and diving like Superman was not a wise thing to do. Because you come down on your arms, and your arms are not meant to bear that kind of weight without breaking. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is facing the very things that scare you to death, and you just, in spite of that, take a step of faith, trusting God. When we built this building, I was oblivious to what all would be involved in the beginning, which is the only reason why I had the faith to kind of pursue it. I just sort of kept taking a step. We'll take the next step. We'll just sort of see what happens, see if the Red Sea opens. We'll just keep walking toward the Red Sea. And we kept taking step, and then next step, and next step, and getting more and deeply involved in the project. And I know of three pastors, the only three pastors who have personally gone through a building project. Every one of them had a heart attack during the building project, which fortunately they didn't tell me about at the beginning of the project. But it became taking a step of faith, and then taking the next step, and taking the next step, and trusting God in the midst of it. Courage is facing your fears. Doesn't mean that we're oblivious to it. Now the thing is, every time you face your fear head on and obey God in spite of the fear that you feel, then what happens is your fear gets a little smaller, and it gets a little smaller, and its power to intimidate you is diminished. Your faith grows, your confidence increases, your joy returns, and every time you act in faith and obedience to God, I think what it does is it sets into motion a spiritual dynamic that releases the power of God in your life. And I think that one of the things that helps me and when we were going through the building project and other situations like that, is the realization that we're acting, stepping out in faith that God has called us to, and that releases the spiritual dynamic that operates and releases the power of God. If, on the other hand, we consistently avoid facing our fears, how many of you know the opposite happens? Our fears get bigger, and they get bigger, and we get smaller and smaller in our own eyes until we succumb to what I call the grasshopper mentality. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, it talks about the spies who went into the land, and they saw the giants in the land, and they came back and they said, we were as grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we were in their eyes. And fearful people have a grasshopper mentality that they see themselves as small and weak and inadequate and assume that other people see them that way as well. Now, the thing about courage is we need to realize courage is not something that happens in rare instances, such as somebody's trapped in a burning building, somebody's drowning, and we're in a position to act. That's not just what courage is about, because it's in the unpublicized moments in the midst of ordinary days in the lives of ordinary people where the most important battles of courage are fought. It's the courage to tell the truth when it would be much easier to tell a lie or to be untruthful. The courage to take a stand for your convictions when you're the only one standing for those convictions and others are attacking you for those positions. That takes courage. Courage is getting up and getting back in the race when you've fallen down. Courage is holding on to your faith in the midst of overwhelming trials when everything inside of you wants to quit. When people are like Job's wife are saying, why don't you just curse God and die? And like Job, we hang on to our integrity and say, even if he slays me, yet will I trust in him. It's the courage to risk relationships when you've been hurt deeply in the previous relationship. It's the courage to resist temptation. It's the courage to hold on to your dreams when you feel like Job, who said, my days are past, my plans are shattered, and so are the desires of my heart. When everything inside of you wants to quit, and you keep holding on, that's courage.